there's a breaking news story in South Carolina athletics, I'm the one you want to follow to find out what's going on with that information. I can guarantee you'll have all details, all sides of the story, just as fast as I can get them, and I can get them pretty fast.
Hi, I'm Gene Sapakoff, sports columnist and college sports editor at the Charleston Post and Courier, and we welcome you to another edition of Countdown to Kickoff, the weekly really cool thing where we talk to David Cloninger, Post and Courier Gamecocks beat writer, about what's going on the football field for the University of South Carolina, who this week faced number 1 ranked Georgia. And before I get into talking to David Cloninger about that, I'd just like to remind you that David's really tremendous newsletter is available at postandcourier.com/Gamecocks Now. David, number 1 ranked Georgia, that point spread's hovering between 24, 25 points. Here they come after beating Oregon 49-3 and beating up on Samford. What are your thoughts for the very banged up Gamecocks going into this game on Saturday at noon at Williams-Brice Stadium?
Well, Gene, I think you have to look at it as 2 things. You got reality and you've got history, okay? History says that this might be the typical USC Georgia game. It's going to be 13-10, 17-10 at halftime. And it'll be like, okay, well, yeah, Gamecocks might stick around and pull this one out. And then Georgia remembers who they are and really owns the second half. But reality, Gene, Gamecocks are going in this game beat up on defense. They've lost Jordan Strawn for the season. They've lost Mo Kaba for the season. R.J. Roderick is questionable to play. Cam Smith is questionable to play. David Spalding is questionable to play. Boogie Huntley is questionable to play. So there's 5 starters and the top backup at nickel that may not be on the field on defense. And, the Gamecocks are really going to be testing their depth. They're going against that. It's only 2 weeks in, but the number 1 scoring offense in college football and the number 8 defense in college football. And this is coming after a couple of weeks where the Gamecocks offense, particularly the rushing offense, has really struggled to get going. Now, last week in Arkansas, they didn't really try to emphasize running the ball, but they struggled with it against Georgia State. And they did pass the ball pretty well against Arkansas last weekend, but they're going to have to do a whole lot more to try to keep even with Georgia.
David, I was in Athens on Monday for Georgia's media availability and talking to Kirby Smart. In fact, I asked him, what's your identity on offense and how did that evolve? And he said it basically has to do with the talent on hand, and that right now we have an experienced quarterback, we have depth on the offensive line, and we have multiple weapons on offense, which when you have an identity like that, it's hard to identify a weakness. But let's talk about the Gamecocks' identity on offense and how that might be evolving, David, not just for this game this week, but looking beyond Charlotte, SC State, and then pardon me for already looking ahead to the October 8th game. You had Spencer Rattler throwing the ball a lot. I think 38 pass attempts at Arkansas, and not that many design carries running backs. Is that what it's going to be, do you think, the pass to set up the run, or what?
Well, I think it might have to be, Gene, just because they're looking at it and saying, well, can you really trust this offensive line to set up a sustained running game? Yeah, Georgia State played kind of a funky defense, moving a lot of guys around, putting extra rushers up there. And again, they didn't really try to run the ball against Arkansas. So the question is still out there. Can South Carolina run the football? I doubt that they're looking at Georgia's defense and finding weaknesses and saying, oh, yeah, we can run the football. I think what they're going to do is stick with what works, which at this moment is Spencer Rattler throwing the ball. Gene, you were there with at Arkansas with me, and line pass blocked pretty well. Yeah, there are a couple times where it broke down, but that's going to happen. On the whole, the line pass blocked pretty well, gave Spencer Rattler room to throw, and he was just kind of erratic in the first half. He had a couple of deep passes that, if those are completions, they're probably touchdowns. So I think that they're going to put the ball in the hands of the most talented guy that they got, which is Spencer Rattler. Let him use his receivers and tight ends, and then they got to get the running game started. There's no question about that. But if it's going to start working through the air, why mess with it? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it is going to be a case, though, to see what they try to do early in the first quarter. Will you try to soften up that Georgia defensive line? Going to be a noon kick in Columbia, South Carolina, which is, about 3 degrees lighter than the surface of the sun. So it's going to be hot out there. Not that Georgia's not used to that, but if you're going to try to wear that defense down, get them off the field, the best way to do that is to start cracking them with the run. But of course, you also want to have production doing that. So this week, it might yield a lot of answers about what South Carolina's offensive identity needs to be. Because right now, we're kind of seeing the same thing we are last year. The offensive identity is go with what works and just hope it does work from game to game.
Welcome again to Countdown to Kickoff, our weekly look at University of South Carolina football. I'm with David Cloninger, the Gamecocks beat writer supreme. And if you want to check out his newsletter, go to postandcourier.com/Gamecocks Now. Now, David, we like to have a little fun here on Countdown to Kickoff. Like you said, I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas with you and had a chance to drive around a little bit in Fayetteville, Arkansas. You can get into Oklahoma, Missouri, and some other states pretty quickly, Kansas even. And I noticed that there was some of the most interesting roadkill I've ever seen in that area. And we have great roadkill in South Carolina, especially more and more armadillos you're seeing. But just for roadkill, interesting roadkill, what state sticks out to you the most in the Southeast Conference?
Oh, I'd probably have to say Florida, just because there's always the chance. It's only happened to me once, and I've been around for a while, that you will either run over or you already see a run over python in the middle of a Florida highway. There is that chance. So you're not probably going to get that the rest of the country, although you might have a rattlesnake or two out in Texas. But yeah, definitely the armadillos in Arkansas and Texas are unique. But you can find a possum, a squirrel, even an occasional deer anywhere. But I'd have to say Florida would have the most interesting roadkill because of the python example.
I'd probably have to agree with you that on the reptile part of Florida. Well, we digress. Getting back onto the field with the Gamecocks. We talked a lot about injuries, and you mentioned Mo Kaba and Jordan Strong and those guys and, the other things. But let's talk about what positive surprises have you seen from this South Carolina team 2 games in, David?
Well, I said it before the season, Gene, that the depth on the defense was really going to have to get tested. And the only way you can do that is put those guys into play. Of course, they weren't anticipating they would have to play this much early, but so far it's been a great surprise, particularly at safety. Nick Emmanwori, the freshman from Irmo, has come in and just really played well at safety. First 2 collegiate games, I believe he had 12 tackles in the first week and 11 tackles last week. He is playing great. He's unafraid. He took on KJ Jefferson, Arkansas's quarterback, last week when KJ decided to keep the ball, ran into a hole, and Nick not only popped him, but stood him up. And so everybody else could finish the tackle. Playing unafraid, playing really well. So Nick Emmanwori's probably been the biggest pleasant surprise on defense. And on offense, we saw it last week. Juice Wells. Antoine Wells comes in from James Madison with the nickname Juice, and he's showing off why he's doing that, because he's definitely supplying some electricity to South Carolina's offense. Nothing against the Gamecocks' other receivers, but they credited his work in practice, the fact that he is catching the ball up here instead of right here, and that's what's gotten him on the field. He had 8 catches last week for nearly 200 yards and a touchdown. So South Carolina's really getting through to all of its wide receivers, all of its pass catchers, because you got to lump the tight ends there too, and that's a good thing to see. Of course, it is kind of coming at the expense of Josh Vann, Gamecock's best receiver last year, who has 1 catch in 2 games, but as Shane Beamer made it very clear, hey, you got to practice. And not that Josh Vann isn't practicing hard, but these other guys are too. And that's it's something that probably needs to be fixed, but right now they've got some other options if it doesn't.
David, you talked about this in your Gamecocks Now newsletter a little bit, but let's talk about one of the elephants in the room on Saturday, and that is Will Muschamp as co-defensive coordinator for Georgia, obviously the former Gamecocks head coach. How much of a factor, if any, is Will Muschamp in knowing much of the South Carolina personnel. There have been changes, but I think it'd be fair to say he knows that offensive line and some of the other guys. How much of a factor is Will Muschamp on Saturday at high noon at Williams-Brice?
I don't think it's going to be much, Gene. I mean, obviously Muschamp's coming back in and he'll get a hearty round of boos from the Williams-Brice faithful. But the fact is that I don't think he's sitting there at Georgia right now diagramming saying, okay, I know we can go with this guy. I know we can go with this guy. And if we run an offensive play, try to get it toward this defender because he doesn't tackle the best. I don't think that's entering into his plans. What I think's entering into his is like, I've got better players than I did at South Carolina on almost every position. So I'm going to trust my general game plan. Now, could there be a lot more relentless pressure than Muschamp ever dialed up here, particularly on defense? Oh, yeah. I mean, his job is right now as co-DC at Georgia is take out Spencer Rattler and shut down that offense. So I'm sure he's going to be bringing it, but it's not going to be any kind of extra code just for he's playing South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina cut him a $12.9 million check to leave, and he still got that great big house out on the lake here. So why's he got to be mad at South Carolina? You know, just go on in here and do what you do.
Very good point, David. We're at that point in our countdown to kickoff episode here where we're going to ask you to tap into the David Cloninger database and give us a score prediction for Georgia against South Carolina on Saturday.
I don't think anybody's going to want to hear it, but I'm looking around Georgia 44-17. It's got the potential to get real ugly on Saturday. Now, South Carolina under Shane Beamer has shown it is not going to give up. These guys fight to the end, and I can say that through every game I've watched under him, and that's something to be credited. But it's kind of like last week, you're playing a better team, and there's no shame in losing to that, and a lot of people are going to get mad and maybe at how the Gamecocks look, but considering their injuries on defense, considering just how good Georgia is, even when they lost 15 guys to the NFL, it might get pretty ugly in Williams-Brice. So I'm going to say 44-17. Might have to tweak that a little, but it won't be too much off that line.
All right. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Countdown to Kickoff. For David Cloninger, I'm Gene Sapakoff of the Charleston Post and Courier. Check out David's newsletter at postandcourier.com/Gamecocks Now, and we'll see you next week.
We'll see you Saturday. Hydrate and wear your sunscreen.